These allegations against FMLN are not true. If they were true, that means that I myself would consider myself a terrorist, which I am not. There are so many bigger issues here that needs to be dealt, because there is no right. There's something wrong in these proceedings, and I have realized that. And we need to get something done so that no more families, no more Salvadoran families or members of FMLN that have been in this situation or could be in this situation, we don't want this to happen to them again.
Everyone's worried about stopping terrorism. That's a really easy way to stop participating.
When a country tries to escape, our first effort is to bludgeon them back into the fold, and if that fails, then the fallback is to start around, create economic chaos so that they will not be a positive example to anyone else to want to break free.
This past week, I wrote a letter to the President of the United States to send no more arms to this country. They are only being used to kill our people.
Jose Figueroa is an El Salvadorian-born man who arrived in Canada in 1997 making a claim for refugee status. The father of 3 Canadian-born children has lived in Langley, BC for over 13 years, but now faces a deportation order due to his affiliation 20 years ago with the Farabunda Marti Front for National Liberation in El Salvador. While a university student, Jose was working with the student union to speak out against the human rights abuses of a violent, repressive government that was using death squads to kill any opposition. When Jose came to Canada, he told Canadian authorities about his association with the FMLN, a coalition of opposition forces fighting against the murderous Salvadorian military government. The Canadian government knew for 13 years that Jose had been associated with the FMLN, and it never expressed any concerns. Until now. So many years later, Canadian authorities are claiming that the FMLN is a terrorist organization and that Jose must leave because his association with the organization 20 years ago makes him a security threat.
About the 1960s into the 1970s, there was a real deterioration in the standards of living of most people in El Salvador. High levels of unemployment, people were being thrown off the land, inflation was eating into people's purchasing power, per capita income, and so there was an actual deterioration in the standard of living for much of the country. In most of Latin America, oligarchic regimes collapsed by the 1930s, and you get the emergence of reformist governments of one sort or another in the 40s, and failed to undertake the kinds of investments that would enable them to be absorbed by industry and to provide for rising incomes. This is a tiny, cruel oligarchy that has always sustained its power through liberal doses of coercion. And so the death squads are part of that. They're the armed wing of the rural oligarchy, and they're there to guarantee that peasants don't get out of line, that they don't take back the land that's theirs, that they don't push too hard to form unions, they don't threaten the interests of the elite. They start in the 1960s, but of course by the time we get to the 1980s, these death squads are highly organized, sophisticated, they're connected to the intelligence service of the military, and they're really a central part of the whole conflict.
The death squad strike at anyone they suspect of working for the guerrillas or sympathizing with them, even when friends are involved.
We have organized, and we still do, and fund death squads in countries around the world, like the Treasury Police in El Salvador.
We were told by members of Dobeson's group that suspected leftists were brought there for interrogation through psychological techniques, and if they did not respond, then that they were tortured, and that they know of no one who had ever reappeared from these houses, that essentially it was an extermination ring.
We lived during that process, repression. We experienced or we were witness of what the Salvadoran government at that time was doing against the civilian population.
No soldier is obliged to obey an order contrary to the law of God. And in the name of our tormented people who have suffered so much, I implore you, I beg you, I order you the repression.
The powerful voice you just heard was Oscar Romero, a revolutionary Archbishop of the Roman Catholic Church in El Salvador. This address was an attempt at ceasing the bloodshed at the hands of the US-backed military Arena Party, also known as the Alianza Republicana Nacionalista. One day after this defiant speech, Romero was dead, gunned down at the hands of the same regime he was pleading with. A defiant act that showed the country and the world that there was no opposing Alianza.
When I first got to El Salvador, I remember seeing graffiti saying, "Be a patriot, kill a priest." That was the work of the death squads that had been around since the 1960s. The biggest one was Orden, but there were a number.
25 years ago, I made a moral decision. And that moral decision was to give my political support to FMLN as a group that was fighting for political changes in our country. That was about the age that my son is right now, about a 13 or 14-year-old. When I first heard about some aspects of the war that was going on in El Salvador. And the first impression that I had was that of the funeral of Archbishop Romero.
Well, there was this funeral of Archbishop, and all of a sudden there were shoots everywhere, and thousands of people that were gathered there to say goodbye to Archbishop Romero were basically repressed by the Salvadoran government at that time. The result of that were like many people were dead, and many were wounded, and many of these persons, peasants and workers and students, were just scattering around.
I was in El Salvador shortly before Romero was killed, and I remember reading Time magazine because you could buy it there, and the story that they told was that there were extremists of the left and extremists of the right, and a lot of civilians were being caught in between. And I remember looking around and saying, this doesn't feel like that to me at all. What I'm seeing here is that there are death squads in the military, and they are systematically attacking anyone who represents any threat to the existing order, whether that be, Catholic priests or students or workers, anyone connected with a wide range of popular organizations.
Suffer as much as you can until the country plunges into chaos, until at some point you can step in and impose your choice of governments on that country.
You can't have a free press in El Salvador without first dismantling the whole terror system that the United States installed precisely to ensure that you can't have things like a free press.
Over time, the U.S. government began to recognize that the situation in El Salvador had become untenable. And the Carter administration in late 1979 put its weight behind the reformist officers who had taken power and hoped to build some kind of political center. When that fizzled as a result of the reaction of the extreme right in El Salvador, and Carter was replaced by Reagan, the U.S. government opted to defend the government against what they saw as a communist revolution. And in particular with Reagan in office, Reagan brought a very strong Cold War worldview to bear on the conflict. He saw El Salvador as becoming potentially a beachhead for the Soviet Union. And he worried that the revolution in Nicaragua that had happened the year before could be replicated in El Salvador and in other countries, Guatemala. And so he did everything that he could to prevent this from happening by backing this repressive government. These military regimes don't attack the guerrillas. They're very reluctant to actually fight people who are armed. They attack the civilian support base of the guerrillas, and that's why they're responsible for 85% of the human rights abuses, right? And that was the thing that the United States was never willing to acknowledge, but it was the most important fact about that struggle. The FMLN looks at this. They know that they can't be defeated militarily. They know that they are a match for the Salvadoran military, perhaps, certainly able to fight it to a standstill. And then the Berlin Wall falls, and the possibility of negotiating some kind of peace truce becomes clear.
We pushed for the war to end, which basically happened in 1992. And at that time, there was a peace agreement that was signed in Chapultepec, Mexico.
In January of 1992, after more than a decade of upheaval in El Salvador, representatives of the El Salvadorian government, as well as the FMLN, negotiated a settlement that was to bring stability to the nation. The peace treaty was overseen by the United Nations and the Roman Catholic Church, and was officially recognized by the US and Canada. In 2009, Mauricio Funes of the FMLN became the first democratically elected president of El Salvador in the country's history.
So what happens with the end of the Cold War is that convenient frame is lost. And I think that Bush and many people were looking for ways of looking for a new frame that would replace the Cold War frame, that would give them the ability to sort of have simple solutions to foreign policy problems around the world.
Today, our fellow citizens, our way of life, our very freedom came under attack in a series of deliberate and deadly terrorist acts. We will make no distinction between the terrorists who committed these acts and those who harbored them.
Every country has the right, not only the right, but the obligation to combat any form of terrorism, whichever way they want. But on that, they have to consider not to be taking people that are innocent on this situation.
This weekend I am engaged in extensive sessions with members of my National Security Council as we plan a comprehensive assault on terrorism. This will be a different kind of conflict against a different kind of enemy. This is a conflict without battlefields or beachheads, a conflict with opponents who believe they are invisible. Victory against terrorism will not take place in a single battle, but in a series of decisive actions against terrorist organizations and those who harbor and support them.
On October 26, 2001, just 6 weeks after the attack on the Twin Towers, the US passed the Patriot Act. The act gave US law enforcement agencies sweeping authority to enact invasive surveillance privileges over American citizens, while extending the definition of terrorism. By implementing the Patriot Act, Bush challenged the freedoms of American citizens under the guise of national security.
Intervene whenever we decide it's in our national security. If you don't like it, intervene. And if you don't like it, get used to it. World, get used to it. We're not going to put up with nonsense. We're not going to put up with nonsense.
Following in the footsteps of their neighbours, Canada implemented the Anti-Terrorism Act. Included in the bill was a broad and ambiguous definition of terrorism. The powers given to the Canadian security establishment have been perceived as being incompatible with the Canadian Charters of Human Rights and Freedoms.
The reason why I object to our legislation with regard to terrorism is I think when we use the word terrorism, that word alone creates a frame. It creates a way of thinking about the problem. And what is evoked in your mind is fanatical minorities trying to impose themselves by force using methods that shock us and shatter our sense of what's normal.
What's happened with the Immigration Act is that the security sections have been written so broadly that essentially what the courts and what the Parliament has said was, well, we can't really define what a terrorist is, so we'll just have to identify them when we see them. And so what happens is that officers have an enormous amount of discretion in deciding whether or not to send somebody for an admissibility hearing. I wouldn't be able to do anything for Nelson Mandela. If Nelson Mandela was sent to a security hearing, I would tell Nelson Mandela, you know what, it's a waste of time for you to pay my fees to hire me to represent you at the hearing because you're going to lose.
We came here in Canada in 1997. The reasons of why we came was basically to present a refugee claim to where we're looking for protection from the Canadian government, because the situation in El Salvador, in a personal basis, wasn't that good. Our life were at risk at that time, and we were looking for a place where we could at least get a little bit of protection so that we could live a better life.
I always believed that Canada was a place where human rights were always respected.
His refugee claim was actually based on the fact that he was a former FMLN member, and that was what put him at risk in El Salvador, given the situation in El Salvador at the time. The claim was denied in 2000. He made an application on humanitarian and compassionate grounds to stay here as a permanent resident, given the fact that he had Canadian-born children, in particular an autistic son who was born here. The minister approved that application for. We're now at the stage where we're making an application for an exemption under Section 34(2) and under Section 25, which is much more realistic in terms of chances of success.
I always saw Canada as a place where at least you could breathe a little bit of freedom. And that was one of the reasons why I had decided to get with my wife and I decided to come. Now, after 13 years, basically, is be a little bit more functional in this society. Well, in El Salvador, he wouldn't have that opportunity.
Government don't care about me. They don't want to know that I'm a Canadian. They wanted to deport me for the interest of parents' care. And they don't care about my special education. They wanted me to adopt to life in El Salvador rather than stay here. And I had to tell them that I'm a Canadian. I am not an El Salvadoran. I'm a Canadian. And I don't want the government to get away with this. And my sisters are Canadians as well. They can't leave Canada. Canadians are not supposed to be deported to their country where their parents' origins, because they have rights. And right now, the government has disregarded my rights.
My moral decision was taken in 1985, and that moral decision still stands.